So, today I'm taking a look at another prominent secondary character of Final Fantasy VII, which is Nanaki, aka Red XIII. Now, I always found Red XIII an interesting cast member in how he contributes to the story, because as a secondary character that orbits the nucleus of primary characters, he had to bring something specific to the table to qualify his inclusion and narrative relevance to Cloud and friends. And where Cid, as we've discussed, brings the means of transport, where Caitzith, or Ketchi, however you pronounce that, brings the important betrayal angle and Shinra spy plot to bear on the party, and where the more primary characters, such as Barrett, brings angles much closer to the central conflict of the story, such as the rebellion against Shinra, Tifa with the relationship to Cloud's past, and Aerith with the role of the Ancient and the White Materia, and this counterbalance to Sephiroth. But looking to Red XIII, it's interesting to see how he offered something not so much tangible as to shift the plot in any one direction, like Cid introducing the tiny Bronco and stuff like that, but rather I think he contributed quite largely to the nuance of the setting, the underlying world building, and the nature of Final Fantasy VII's planet. And I've mentioned in the past that Final Fantasy VII's structure permits each personal character arc to be explored in their own unique areas and points of the story. So we have Barrett in Corel, we have Cid in Rocket Town, Cloud and Tifa in Nibelheim, and so on. In each of these they confront an aspect of their past. And Red XIII is no exception to this, because in his scenario at Cosmo Canyon, we firstly have his confronting of the past in the form of his warrior father Seto, but perhaps more importantly, as a contribution to the overall story, he introduces us to Bugenhagen and the worldview that he has fostered growing up as a prospective guardian of this inquisitive, natural science-inclined environment of Cosmo Canyon. And I really do feel the need to advocate for Nanaki's inclusion sometimes, because I've seen some fans and some forum posts over the years that consider him one of the less important, or indeed a pointless party member. But I think looking at his scenario at Cosmo Canyon and his characterization, he offers a huge amount of clarity and conviction as to why we should be opposed to Shinra and why we should be mindful of the planet and stuff like that. So a really good counterbalance and reasoning to oppose this sort of Mako production and the negative consequences that Shinra is creating for the planet. And I played through the Cosmo Canyon segment recently, actually, and I always forget what a really quite poignant, beautiful sequence it is when we're in Bugenhagen's observatory and there's that projection explaining the cyclical nature of the lifestream, and we have Uematsu's lifestream theme playing, so quite powerful stuff that I think that communicates a sense of wonderment about life itself, really. And while some fans might argue that, well, we could have arrived at Cosmo Canyon without Red XIII's input, I think he really does carry that sense of curiosity and wonderment and objective observations about the world around him with him throughout the game. And while, yes, we have Aerith, who is also a character that's attuned to the lifestream and attuned to the natural world, and has some of this sentiment that's inherited from her mother, she's also somewhat naive, having lost her mother as a child. And of course, she famously doesn't survive half of the game. So Red XIII, having grown up in Cosmo Canyon, not being human, and not being familiar with the advances and the human conflicts and civilization and stuff like that, he does provide a very unique angle and take on the world, particularly if you keep him in the party and observe his unique dialogue options at certain key intervals. So I like that, and I think it does a lot in service of the setting and justifying why resistance factions such as Avalanche, which was indeed founded at Cosmo Canyon, have a reason to exist. And not only that, but shifts in the plot maintain Red XIII's reason for being. Because initially, if you recall, he just wants to stay with us from Midgar until he arrives home in Cosmo Canyon, and yet it is Bugenhagen who convinces Nanaki to continue on with Cloud & Co, as he quite fatalistically states that he doesn't think we can change the fate of the planet or save it from either Shinra or Sephiroth, but he would like Red XIII to at least try and do that. So a nice turn of events there, and a nice little conclusion between Nanaki, Bugen, and Seto at the end of the Cosmo Canyon scenario. Now, as with most other Final Fantasy characters, Red XIII has a penchant for comedy too, and I think what I like most about the comedy found in Final Fantasy VII, and indeed most Final Fantasy games, is that the characters don't realise that they are funny. It's very deadpan and situational. So, for example, a renowned scene with Red XIII is when our party has stowed away on the cargo ship and are dressed up as Shinra infantrymen, and we see him wobbling around the deck on two legs, trying to pretend he's human with this tail poking out, which in and of itself is a completely ridiculous scenario. But when we speak with him, he says how he thinks he's making a really good go of acting human with complete sincerity, which just doubles down on the comedy there. And actually on my current playthrough, just the other day, I noticed that arriving in Costa del Sol, our party remarks on how cute Barret looks in his sailor uniform. But one thing I hadn't noticed before is that if you go to the inn at Costa del Sol when Barret's not in your party, you can actually see him trying on the sailor's outfit in the bathroom and shouting that it's occupied. So that's a good, another good example of the comedy there that I don't recall seeing before. So, all things considered, Red XIII is a great source of comedy throughout the game, and actually I'd argue he's one of the funnier party members too, because not being human, not being familiar with things, and indeed having this rather high-level philosophical perspective on things, he does come out with some amazing one-liners and absurd statements that, perhaps owing to the translation as well, end up reading as pretty hilarious statements in a lot of cases. And I do recommend playing through the game with Red XIII as a prominent party member, just to try and catch some of these ridiculous one-liners that he has. So, moving on to aesthetics, Red XIII represents the non-human character, which was a recurring feature of early Final Fantasy titles, but seems to have increasingly been phased out over the past few installments. I think Kimahri in Final Fantasy X was... we had Fran in Final Fantasy XII, who was one of the Viera. But 13, 15, 16, these mainline titles, they are lacking in the non-human party members and general diversity, as we've seen over the years. But where non-humans, such as the aforementioned Kimahri and Fran, usually emphasise the plot point of some marginalised race that we meet along the way, there was no such angle with Red XIII, and indeed, quite to the contrary, he was presented as the last of his species and the long-running Cosmo Canyon Guardians in Final Fantasy VII, which was quite an interesting take, and I think it lends to this idea of diminishing life and irreparable damage to the planet, with these dying out species and whatnot, that the world of Final Fantasy VII really drives home thematically. And one of the many things that Red XIII shares in common with Aerith is that they are, of course, the last of their kind, and indeed it's the entire reason that Hojo brings them together and attempts to breed them in the first place, which is how we meet him in the original game. But aesthetically, at least, I think Red XIII, very cool looking character, fantastic colour palette, and a great juxtaposition between this grizzled, scarred up beast and the quite laconic, polite demeanour that he actually has. And all due credit to the remake voice actor and generally how Red XIII was adapted there, because I think they did a really good job bringing to life this sort of hostility, but also this kind of soft touch in his demeanour. And I'll touch on the remake Red XIII in a moment. But finally, just to follow up on that note of Red XIII being the last of his kind, and how the compilation material of Final Fantasy VII has extrapolated on small threads of secondary story and secondary characters, as I've recently noted in episodes around Zack, Cloud and Sephiroth. These expanded stories do tend to complement, but also sometimes conflict with the original game, because it's worth noting that in Before Crisis, we see Red XIII's origins as an aspiring guardian of Cosmo Canyon, but we also briefly see his prospective mate, the character Deneh, who is introduced as another, beast-like creature, Red XIII's species, who he's expected to perpetuate the species with. And yet she disappears sometime after this, in Before Crisis. She's never seen again. But many fans theorise that Red XIII has eventually reconciled with her, which would account for the cubs that we see in Final Fantasy VII's post-credits scene. So that sort of cobbles together some sense, but obviously it would mean that Red XIII isn't quite the last of his species. So, moving on, and coming now to the Final Fantasy VII Remake, this is the first real return I think we've seen to Red XIII since the original Final Fantasy VII, and unlike, for example, the previously discussed Sid Highwind, he doesn't feature too much in other Square titles or extended universe material, barring some very fleeting appearances. So, for example, we see him for a couple of seconds in Advent Children, a couple of seconds in other titles, and that's really it. And I think the lasting criticism, or commentary for some, on his remake debut, kind of coming to that, is the fact that he's not playable. And on the one hand, I understand having this exciting character dangled in front of us towards the end game, and not being able to use him is frustrating. But on the other hand, I do completely understand why he's not playable, and it would, for me, be even more frustrating to acquire him so close to the ending, but then only be able to spend, a very short amount of time with him. And I think part of the complexity and the concern around ending the remake at the logical point they did, which is leaving Midgar, is that, of course, in the original game, that is when we meet Red XIII. We meet him in Hojo's lab, and there was no way to really avoid including him at that particular point. So I get it, and personally I wasn't overly concerned about not being able to control Nanaki at that point. But I do understand how others might have been. But moving on, and relating back to Nanaki's affinity to the planet, to the lifestream, and having mentioned that he shares this sort of affinity with Aerith, this is something that is really amplified in the remake. And I quite liked this allusion and hinting that Red XIII too knows at least some of what's going on with regards to fate, the Whispers, the planet, and so on. And if not the nature of Aerith specifically, as an ancient, then he certainly knows, a lot about her. Obviously they have their sort of bonding sequence in the beginning. And I suppose rooting back to his wisdom and his origins in Cosmo Canyon, I think he might prove one of the more insightful, information-dropping, world-building characters in the next instalment, building on what was established in the original title. Additionally, I think, at least for a portion of the next instalment, they will dedicate side quests or some scenarios to Red XIII anyway, because, of course, we've been introduced to him, but we haven't yet been introduced to his handling, his playstyle, and so on. So I look forward to how that transpires. But ultimately, I do think Red XIII will have great input and stakes in future events, insofar as he understands the planet in a similar way that Aerith does. And I think he'll contribute in fleshing out this new world and the circumstances, particularly once we arrive at Cosmo Canyon, and hopefully get to meet Bugenhagen in much the same way we did. So that about wraps up my thoughts on Red XIII. If you got this far, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. And I'd love to hear your thoughts, opinions, and theories on this character, and where you think the game is headed.